In this video, we're going to introduce our unit on ecology. Ecology is the scientific study of the interaction of organisms and their environment. The major questions that ecology tries to address are varied and include, from organismal ecology, how does an organism's behavior, physiology, and morphology allow it to cope with its environment? From population ecology, we ask, what factors affect a population size and composition, and how? From community ecology, we get questions like, how do predation, competition, and other interactions affect species? From ecosystem ecology, we ask questions like, how does energy flow, and how do chemicals cycle throughout a biological system? And we can ask questions like, how humans impact the environment. As we try to answer these questions, we find that we have to employ special techniques to conduct tests in the field, and that it's difficult to control for variables. So often, initial field tests will lead to more controlled investigations in the lab, which in turn lead to manipulations in the field. We also find that mathematical models are useful to simulate conditions which allow us to make predictions. And included in our study of ecology, we'll be able to see how looking at interactions between species and their environments can help us understand some of the concepts of evolution. Before we go much further, let's make sure we can define some helpful terms. First, species. Let me make all of these bigger. Hold on. Okay. Species. All the individuals that make up an interbreeding group. The best way to define species is to say it this way. Two organisms are considered to be in the same species if they can mate and produce fertile offspring. Population. A population is all the individuals of a given species in a given area. For example, all of the certain species of grasshopper in my backyard would be a population of grasshoppers. All the white-tailed deer in a forest area would be a population of white-tailed deer. Well, communities are made up of all the populations in a shared habitat. So a community, in one forest there might be many populations, populations of trees and deer and rabbits and grasshoppers that all make up the community that we see in that habitat. And the ecosystem is all of the communities and the abiotic features of the environment. So the living things, the living communities, plus the abiotic features such as the terrain, the temperature, the water, and so forth that make up the whole system. Since ecology includes both living things and their non-living environment, let's take a look at the abiotic non-living factors, abiotic or non-living factors, that lead to the vast environmental diversity that exists on the planet. These factors include temperature. The temperature of an environment will affect what kinds of organisms can inhabit an area. We know that metabolic rate is affected by temperature due to the sensitivity of enzymes to temps. Some organisms can regulate their body temperatures and therefore can withstand a broader range of habitat. Water. Water is an essential factor in life. For aquatic animals, they must deal with the movement of water in and out of their cells as dictated by the relative concentration of solutes, or osmolarity. For organisms in salt water, they must protect against the loss of water. And for freshwater organisms, they have the problem of absorbing too much water. For terrestrial or land organisms, there's always the fight against desiccation or water loss to the relatively dry air surrounding them. Sunlight is another abiotic factor. The basis of energy flow through an ecosystem relies on the conversion of solar energy into organic material via photosynthesis. We also see photoperiods, which are cues based on the length of the day that affect processes such as flowering and other seasonal changes in plants such as dropping leaves, and they also affect behavioral changes in animals such as the timing and pattern of migrations, the timing of sexual receptivity, hibernation, and other types of behaviors that are related to the time of the year. Of course, rocks and soil make up the part of the abiotic factors that determine what organisms can live in a certain area. Wind is an abiotic factor that we may not think immediately affects living things, but it amplifies the effects of temperature, it increases evaporation, and it actually can change the shapes of plants, like this tree down here. The final one of our abiotic factors that we look at in ecology that affect the distribution or the diversity of the environments are periodic disturbances. Fires, hurricanes, volcanoes, typhoons that tend to wipe out large segments of an ecosystem and set it up to reestablish with new growth and new animal and plant species in a process called succession. All of these factors affect the distribution of life across the planet. Let's take a look at where life is distributed on the planet. The biosphere is a term that means the portion of the Earth inhabited by life, and it represents the sum of all the communities and ecosystems. The largest portion of the biosphere is aquatic. Let's look at this picture. Here we see the distribution of photosynthetic organisms across the biosphere. On this scale, we have a scale of the concentration of chlorophyll A, basically where the aquatic photosynthesizing organisms are, and the darker areas was where we have very little photosynthetic activity. And moving up the scale from this dark purple to blue to green to yellow to red, we see more and more in the aquatic areas photosynthesis going on. So we can see where the photosynthetic aquatic things are. And then this scale, the minimum is on this side, and going to the darker green and blue, showing our terrestrial photosynthesizers. We can see how patchy the distribution of photosynthetic organisms on the planet is. It's certainly not a homogeneous distribution. It's very much a heterogeneous distribution. Making up this biosphere are many biomes. A biome is is defined as major types of communities, often named for the predominant vegetation, but also characterized by the animals that have adapted to that environment. There are very seldom sharp boundaries between each biome. They kind of grade into each other in what we call a cline, and they may be patchy, and they have a prevailing climate, a temperature and rainfall, which is most important in determining the biome type. Let's look at some of these biomes. Our major terrestrial biomes, as determined by temperature and rainfall, are tropical rainforests, which we see here. They're typified by large amounts of rainfall, dense population of plants and animals. There's a very steep competition for sunlight. And then we have savannas, which are open grasslands with scattered trees about. We have some pictures here of savannas. We also have deserts, which are typified by obviously very little rainfall, and plants and animals that have special adaptations to handle these extreme temperature variations and lack of water. And we have the Mediterranean scrub or chaparral biome that you see here. And we can move here to grasslands, which we might see in the central parts of many continents. Let me type this in here. And we have our temperate forests with our deciduous trees that drop their leaves to conserve water in times of when the daylight gets short in different times of the year. And we have our conifer forest, where the dominant plant life are the pine trees, and which then grades into the taiga as we move to the more northern or southern latitudes. And finally, we get to the tundra, which is the characteristic that they share is a permanently frozen subsoil called permafrost. So there's a sampling of our terrestrial biomes. Let's look at our marine biomes, or our aquatic biomes. Actually, before we do that, let's look at this map that shows how these different biomes are distributed across the planet. Again, we see a very heterogeneous distribution, some patchy areas, but you can see that every continent has basically, almost every continent has each of these biomes. And if we were to zoom in into any one of these boundaries between these biomes, what might we see? Well, the answer is we'd see a cline, or an ecocline, a gradual gradation from one ecosystem to another, where we don't always see the sharp boundaries between the two. as one grades into the other and gradually changes. Now let's look at our aquatic biomes. Well, we have our freshwater biomes, ponds, lakes, rivers, and streams. Lakes and ponds, there's the lake that I grew up on, Lake Wateree in South Carolina. Rivers and streams, swamps, those are our freshwater aquatic biomes. And then in our marine biomes, we have estuaries, the mudflats and salt marshes, which is really a very important basis of the food chain in the ocean. Then we have the where do I go from here? The intertidal zone, which is the zone between the high tide and the low tide, and the types of things that can live in that type of aquatic biome. We have our coral reefs, which again is a very important part of our ecosystem biomes. And then we have our open ocean zones, the photic zone, the top layer, which light will penetrate, and the pelagic zone, the open water, and then the benthic zone as a biome, the bottom of the ocean, as an aquatic marine biome. I'm going to wrap up this video, but I also want to preview the next one. The next video in this series will investigate these aquatic biomes a bit further. We're going to discuss oligotrophic lakes versus eutrophic lakes. We're going to talk about the process of lake death. And we're also going to talk about how the different zones in these aquatic environments allow for different types of things to live in them. We're going to discuss lake turnover. We'll have to remind ourselves about the properties of water a little bit there. And then we're also going to talk about the terrestrial ecological succession, both primary and secondary succession. So that'll be in part 2 of our introduction to ecology.